on up. Sharon might come. I don't know. I haven't seen her in a while.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. For anybody who doesn't know me, my name is Laura Dumahosky. I am the Media Services Librarian and Assistant Director here. And I inherited this program last year, and I really love it. It's a great program. We're in our 43rd year, we think. And this is the Spring of 2026 series, and our theme this spring is Important Anniversaries in American History. There'll be more at the end, little teasers.
All right, hello, my name is Christina Mortolero-Frank. I am one of the Book Sandwiched In committee members. First of all, we'd like to thank the Friends of the Richmond Memorial Library for sponsoring this program. Due to their generosity, you may help yourselves to cookies, coffee, and hot tea. Plus, if you've not already done so, make sure you put your name in for today's door prize, which is $10 to the coffee press. Also, if you want to become a member of the Friends of the Library, I highly recommend it because it helps supplement our programming. Plus, if you donate $10, you get a $5 voucher for the monthly book sale. So you can get those forms at the front desk. Okay, so first, I'm not your speaker today. Dr. Tim McCorry is going to be your speaker today. He is the Assistant Professor of Social Sciences at Genesee Community College. He is also the Coordinator of Special Programs, who I work with closely. He can also speak a little bit more about that too. So Tim has 25 years of experience teaching various courses in sociology, psychology, and criminal justice at Genesee Community College, the University at Buffalo, Buffalo State University, and Medaille University. He earned his associate degree from Nassau Community College, his bachelor's and master's degrees from St. John's University, and his PhD from the University at Buffalo. As a sociologist and former president of the New York State Sociological Association, his research interests have been primarily focused on community-oriented, applied research on a variety of topics such as juvenile delinquency, substance abuse, and public policy. More recently, he has presented research on topics including higher education in-prison college preparation, and reentry support programs, restorative justice programs, applied ethics and criminal justice, and the formation of community collaborative partnerships to solve social problems. This semester, he is working on a collaborative project with GCC's library in commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, in which students can submit creative interpretations of what liberty means to them. So I would like to welcome Dr. Tim McCorry as our speaker today.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me. I think about these kind of places and events like a civic epicenter, a place that we can discuss our civics, our country. I'm not going to be the final answer to this book or the review, so I look forward to questions after the review. One of the things we're doing at Genesee Community College is we're commemorating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And I think the book is chosen for that. And one of the things that the book wants to point out, and the author, Edward Larson, was what is significant about 1776 and why do I remember back in 1976, that being a major event, and why is this significant? And I remember songs being sung, Elton John and Philadelphia Freedom, and going to Philadelphia with my family, and kind of getting into this civic experience. And so one of the things that he talks about is that the American Revolution had started in 1775, and some of the fights, and do you remember I don't know if you remember your history lessons. I learned about Concord and Lexington and Bunker Hill and all these kind of things, and start learning about the American Revolution. And Ken Burns has a documentary on it. Did anyone see that? I think he really does a good job, and some of the preparation of this commemoration is kind of watching that documentary, reading different books on, you know, who were the framers of the Constitution. And, but one of the things that this book adds, prior to reading it, I read David McCullough's book, 1776. I don't know if anyone has read that. A lot of that focuses on, you know, it seems really enamored with George Washington and kind of the experience of what it would be like to be a soldier and why they were fighting. It's really vivid and really good at describing the military conquests and things that were happening. For example, in the beginning, you know, say 1776, a lot of the historians start chronologically, same with this book. This book adds a thing that I didn't know. You know, I always think about the revolution being fought in Boston, right, and Massachusetts, New York, you know, and things like that. But it starts off talking about Norfolk. And I didn't know anything about that. But what he's talking about is this event that happens where there's already this kind of argument about, you know, concerns about taxation without representation. And it kind of, that really got instilled to me as a young person, right? That's what we were fighting for. But one of the things you look at prior to 1776 and the events in Norfolk, that most people in Britain's 13 North American colonies thought if they could keep what they considered their basic rights as British subjects. So they were kind of like, you know, we want representation, but within the system of the monarchy. And that was kind of their understanding. And you can see that the author lays out these kind of, you know, proclamations. And so a lot of people were, maybe we're going to have this fight, but maybe we're going to have reconciliation, you know. And maybe even writing to the king, could we have reconciliation under these conditions? And maybe thinking about, could we have a seat in Parliament to make decisions about taxation? Because it kind of wasn't making sense anymore. The United States was really becoming, you know, a huge country. Why is this little island over here? You know, and it takes so long to get, you know, a message from one place. It's almost impractical in some of those arguments. But one of the things they start to shift towards, once the king, and what Larson says, the king writes back at the end of 1775 that, you know, I reject your reconciliation. I reject, you know, I'm the sovereign. I'm the king. I make the decisions. And that's when you start to see a shift, and that's what this book is about. Why 1776 and why does it matter? Is because we start to shift in this country towards a Declaration of Independence, which he starts to, the author of the book, I think, says it's both the pen, both the battles and the pen. And so that's what I think the book adds is the ideas. And who is the main person, the main author? Does anyone know who's going to say is going to be the main person that we're going to remember today? Who's going to light the fire about the Declaration of Independence? It's going to be Thomas Paine. So here's what I've been doing in this whole, you know, beginning of the year. I've been reading all things Thomas Paine. And I would suggest doing that, starting, you know, with Common Sense, American Crisis, Rights of Man, The Age of Reason, and all these books where you really start to see, like, why Hamilton is a thing. In other words, the play that brings rap music. I'll bring a little bit of New York, that braggadocio, you know, like, who do you think you are? You know what I'm saying? Like this kind of idea, because this is what I'm getting, and I think the book misses this a little bit, okay? That Thomas Paine is engaged in polemics. And polemics is when I am attacking another person's position. And I'm going to win this argument. It's almost like a militaristic argument. You know, it's not, I don't think it's like the European philosophers. It's probably not even like John Locke, who they borrow from. You know, where it's more erudite or abstract. I like philosophy, but this is more pragmatic. And this is attacking the king. Now, to do that, what are you doing? You're risking your life, correct? So Thomas Paine is signing it as CS or Common Sense, and he's working with Franklin in Philadelphia. He was an immigrant. Well, you think he's a British subject coming here. Comes here in 1874, so he's only here, like, you know, really quick. And one of the things I want to point out about Paine, because when I tell my friends that I'm doing this, and one of the things that Larson talks about early on, he's like, well, and my students are like this as well, that, the American dream and this idea of rights, it's all an illusion. In other words, the framers had slaves. And next week you're going to talk about Native Americans, and women did not have rights, right? And other things we talk about in terms of this expansion of, rights of men. But the idea that one of the things we were looking at is that Paine was one of the first to write about a critique of slavery. One of the first, like even in this area, right? Abolitionists are here arguing against slavery, and that's one of the things that he was arguing against. The other thing Paine writes about in 1775 is about the emancipation of women. So one of the things that we did in terms of the commemoration, just to step aside from the book, and the idea of applied sociology is, I'm taking my students to the Women's Rights Museum and look at how the women who in 1848 expanded the words of Thomas Jefferson, say that all men and women are created equal, and that kind of is a difference. And so that's one of the things that the book kind of picks up on, that there was some contradictions in the beginnings of our country, but that Paine was the one that really attacked the idea of a rejection of the monarchy, the rejection of kings. And you see those protests today over the weekend, no kings protest. Where does that come? The book is about why does this matter? What is this all about? We still see this kind of thing. We are not ruled by kings. It's not about inheritance. And these kind of questions about authoritarian rule that are still in this country today. So one of the things that he talks about with Paine's common sense, and I think, again, the author misses it a little bit, is that Paine starts to see what the United States is going to become. The United States, maybe they had like 3 or 4 million people, there's 13 colonies, but he sees it's going to be a continent, and it's going to be the most prosperous continent on earth. He sees the economic prosperity that could be unleashed if we could be free. Also at the time, I don't think the book talks about that, is that Adam Smith in 1776 writes the Wealth of Nations. And what is that? He's known as the father of capitalism, right? The idea of free trade, and those kind of things are going to come in. What does Smith say? Similar to Paine, he sees that the United States is probably going to win this war, and the United States is going to probably be the most prosperous country on earth, the most powerful country. So I see Paine, he sees what America is going to be, and he doesn't see the pragmatism of being ruled. He sees like we need to be free. He's going to attack this sovereign rule, the kings, and he's going to argue, I would say, he's going to be more of what I would say a populist, meaning he really believes that the power does not come from God, divine right, it comes from the people, right? And that's really gets ingrained in us, the consent of the people. And that the people, we make law, and we are going to be governed by a rule of law within a constitutional framework. So he's going to lay that out as an idea. Now, all of his ideas don't come to fruition because, as you may have learned, that there were a lot of compromises, and one of the things that he saw, what the book points out, is he wanted to have, like in France, a national assembly, or you would have like a one-body legislative branch, and the people would have fair, frequent elections, and that would be kind of what would be the check against tyranny. What the book then starts to go into is the importance of John Adams. So John Adams, I'm not a historian, but I remember, watching the series on John Adams. I think he defended the Redcoats in the Boston Massacre. And I think that's something that I could probably do. And the reason why I could do it is because my dad was a lawyer. Does that make sense to you? I like to play devil's advocate as a professor so that students don't really know my position. And it makes me a little bit uncomfortable when I have to give speeches like that, because we are trained as social scientists that, you stay neutral, you stay objective, stay close to the book, don't really state your own opinion or you're getting kicked out. That's what I was told. But the thing is that sometimes there are certain matters as a citizen I want to talk about or talk to you about. But a lot of times as a professor, I think in liberal education, we're trying to have you shape your own opinion, right? You read the book, you make your decision, you have free speech, you have your freedom of conscience, you know, you have your own religious beliefs or whatever it is, and then we kind of come into debate with that. And so I think that, so I think in some ways I really like Paine, and probably Christina knows me, I'd probably be with him on this populist, you know, and I would say that probably that would be more of like where a Democrat is. Does that make sense to you? So, but there's another side to me that's more my dad, right? My mom's a social worker, by the way. Okay, so you gotta explain some things here. Okay, I got this battle in my head, which is gonna win here. Anyway, so the dad side of me is gonna be about the law, and that's where Adams is gonna say, you know what? I don't agree with Paine. I don't agree that human beings, like Paine and Smith, I think they thought, if we allow for freedom of exchange and free trade and everyone has their rights, we're not going to have wars. We're not going to have, maybe we'll have inequality, but Paine was a tax collector and he believed that maybe we could have progressive taxation. And, you know, a lot of times there's riots and things because people don't have something to eat. Maybe we can solve that. I think that's more, some people have asked, is he a socialist, you know, on that side. So probably more Democrat. But on the other side, you have Adams, who questions Paine's belief in human nature. Like John Locke believed that human beings were tabula rasa. Everything we know is based on experience and the importance of socialization. And that's, as a sociologist, is the basic thing, the importance of parents, the importance of school, the importance of religion, but also what we see now, the importance of social media, AI, all these things that shape us. But one of the things with Adams, he really was concerned that we would be jealous, we would be competitive. Someone, one of us, might want to be a dictator, you know, might want to take over the country. And what did he suggest? He suggests that we should not have just one body. We should have two bodies, right, in the legislative. And we copy that throughout. And that there would be checks on each other. And then also that you would have a judiciary, right? We're hearing cases today about birthright citizenship. You know, a Supreme Court and the idea of a rule of law. And we're going to respect that. And, you know, so also the ideas of federalism. We're not just going to have, let's say, these states that are going to be sovereign. We're also going to have a federal government with checks and balances. And so sometimes I think, while I'm influenced by this book and see the importance of Paine, the book also talks about the importance of John Adams and others in creating this other side, which I might call the Republican side of me. Does that make sense? Where I would say probably more of the old style Republican. You believe in a republic. You would believe in elected representatives and a rule of law and precedent. I think that would be something, and that we're going to honor our country and look at our framers in that way. After Adams, what the book then starts to go into is once you start to have in July, you know, the Continental Congress is meeting about military battles and other things like this and trying to keep the troops going. It looks like, you know, from my reading of the book, when I'm looking at the military, Washington successful in Boston, right, in pushing people out. Then they go to New York and they make some mistakes. And then he's on the run. And I think Paine is like, you know, because the United States is so big, it's very hard for another country to kind of occupy another one, you know, especially when you're defending. And he starts to see, you know, we have an advantage because we're not going to give in. And if we're united about this independence thing, they're not going to win. And so it takes us through the book takes us through the whole year in the military battles. And basically it looks like Washington wasn't doing so well. And maybe at the very end has a success in Trenton, which gets people kind of, you know, riled up. But the big thing that happened in 1776 is that Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence. And I think it's that moment, July 4th, that we celebrate the birthday of the United States. Now some don't, you know, practice that. They might be like, no, it's Juneteenth, when slaves are free, or, there's kind of debates about where this is going to be. But the book says, why is it that we have it at 1776 and not when we win the war? And I think I was walking the dog today, I was like, because it's an American thing to say it's when we decided. It's not what they told, or it had nothing to do with them. It's when we decided to declare independence. That's when we are a birth of a nation. And it puts the onus on us. And it's about our liberty and our self-governance. And I think that's what they're practicing in terms of that. So I think after the Declaration of Independence, where I think Thomas Jefferson, the book Larson talks about his prose and why it's so important today, because it becomes the basis by which everyone is going to say, even if they say, it's all bullshit, it's all illusion, they're going to go to court and sue on the basis of I have rights. There's going to be a French Revolution, which pain is going to go there, and it's going to trickle out around the world in which people are arguing for rights. So don't you think, like lots of people are saying, like I have rights when I have students that are from Liverpool or Great Britain, I say, do you have a right to bear arms? And they're like, I'm not really sure. And I'm like, no one here is unsure. No one here is unsure. We're just going to argue about what it means and where are the restrictions. And I really, for myself, I'm always about freedom of speech, academic freedom. I'm like, the First Amendment comes first. And these are the debates I'm going to have with the Second Amendment folks. But the idea is I do also think that speech could be regulated, if that makes sense in terms of, not being able to yell fire in a crowded theater. And I think when you look later on, the reason why that comes out is because people become concerned, especially after the Civil War. How are we going to get along? And how are we going to have a political democracy where we allow, we debate not through war, but we debate through our words. And we're going to have a regulation on that, where we're not going to be inciting each other. But I do see Paine as really poking that stick and coming up to that line, if that makes sense, in terms of his speech and almost militaristic. But I'm going to end by saying that after the Declaration of Independence, and I think as a result of all the debates that were going on, you start to see a constitutional movement in the United States. And all the states the colonies start to write their state constitution. So the book uses the metaphor of like a fleet of ships that are all going to take off and have different experiences. And eventually they're all going to come into the port, but not at the same time. Does that make sense? So, and it makes it where teaching criminology and teaching criminal justice, it makes it hard to teach people that want to be public servants about the law, doesn't it? Because whenever you want to ask a question about what is the law, don't you have to say it depends or I don't know? Because doesn't one state have one law and another state, and don't we now have 50 states and territories and sovereign Native Americans? It makes it very complicated to make broad brushes about what we are about. But I think the book does talk about this, the importance of the Declaration of Independence, that we were going to reject monarchies, reject rule by inheritance, and I think that has relevance still today. So I think that would be my opening remarks, and I will open it up for questions.
Okay, so you talked to me in my office about Thomas Paine and the French Revolution.
Yeah.
Was that covered in the book, or is that just from outside?
No, because it's not covered because it's later on.
Because it's
so
later on? Okay.
What I would do if you're reading this book, and I would read Common Sense, and then there's the American Crisis. So you would go there and I think I picked that up from the book, because at the end he's writing American Crisis and he's chronicling and writing diaries. Like Paine is like not just a philosopher, he joins the military. He's fighting alongside, and he writes some really, like he's calling out the generals. He's like, okay, you've moved over there. You're going to take over that. You're going to stay in New Jersey or wherever you're staying, or maybe you're going to take Philadelphia, but you're just going to piss off more of the Tories. And then it's going to be more for us. If Tories would be someone who is in favor, still loyal to the king. So when you're kind of like quartering, you're staying, and then what was happening you know, they were pillaging, you know, and they were doing terrible things to the citizens and burning the houses. And so it was just making it worse as it went along. So he is chronicling that in American Crisis. And then in The Rights of Man, he's really going against, in a polemic, an argument against Edmund Burke, a conservative, who's arguing for these, you know, these new revolutions are causing disorder, you know, and a concern, especially in France and in Europe, like, where's going to be tradition? What about the role of religion? Things that, you know, are really conservative, like what's going to happen to our society if we all have liberty and freedom? Like, what's it going to be based on? And I do think that that was a concern of sociologists as well, and still is, how we're going to have order. But I think that what I learned is that Paine goes over to France, and he becomes an honorary citizen of France, then becomes part of the National Assembly, and he's arguing, and he's chronicling there, like almost like a diary, what happened at the storming of the Bastille, and you know, it's from his perspective, and I'm not a historian, so I'm kind of relying on him to tell, you know, his interpretation of what is happening in that time. But the thing is, what happens eventually in France is you have the Reign of Terror, and they start going after the kings and the queens, and I think it offended Paine, because I think he thought that rights go to everybody. Like, in other words, you should have a rule of law for every, you know, and I think he was against that, and being against that made it that he was a moderate, and then he's in prison in France. So here he is, he's in Great Britain, he's going to be tried for treason and hung. In France, he's in prison. I think Hamilton or someone come out to get him out of there. And then he writes Age of Reason, and he basically, I think what he's going to argue is what's in the Bible is mostly BS. Okay, that's what he's going to argue. He's a deist, and a lot of the framers are deists, and they believed in a creator, but they're not sure about all these stories of the Bible. Does that make sense to you? So your rights come from a creator, I know that. But I'm not so sure about everything, and it really believed in the idea of reason would be that we should not be relying on a pope, king, anyone. We can govern ourselves, and we can create a perfect government somehow with reason. I think that's what they were going for, and why the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, influenced this time period. But anyway, after that, he comes to the United States, with a very religious place, and he's kind of more, you know, writes this book. And I don't even want to say he's ahead of his time, because I don't know where he stands. And I think sometimes I think people refer to me as a wild card, because they don't really know where I stand. Because in some ways, I'm very much a civil libertarian. Does that make sense? In other words, I'm going to be about people's rights. But in other times, I want those to be expanded. And so it makes it complicated in terms of, and especially playing devil's advocate. Nobody knows where the hell I am. Anyway, and I figured I'd stay without PowerPoint, so it'd be a little more, you know, freestyle. But anyway, that's where he goes to France, and it's really, you know, the book talks about when the French come involved, and they help out, that really assisted the United States, you know, in terms of winning the battles and winning the war. Anybody else? Yeah.
I was wondering, as you were talking about, you know, I'll say we want our freedom, we don't want to be ruled, we this, that, and the other. Did anybody write about or think about overtaking the native population as they were, you know, creating this United States, and so they're going to be...
Yeah, right, so...
What about that?
When I prepare for a talk, when I'm about half an hour before, you know, you see me go to the other, I better know the answer to this question. So Paine, I'm going to stay with Paine here, okay? Because that's what the book's, a lot of it's about. I don't know everybody else. I think he thought, because when he's visioning a continental United States, I think he envisions that Native Americans would be assimilated. In other words, they would become part citizens. It's not really what happens, right? We start to have, you know, sovereign territory and treaties. And so that creates multiple sovereignties in the United States and really complicated politics in New York State, correct? Which I think we're gonna go over with Red Jacket and that whole history. But, you know, I think, I have students that, that are, you know, my students at GCC and Buff State, and, you know, that are at the Native American, and really complicated law in terms of, like, say, where does your tribal membership come from? And a lot of it comes from your mother, depending on the tribe. So you're looking at, like, when we went to the Women's Rights Museum, they're going to be talking about Native women and how women had more power within Native communities. Also, David Burns talks about how the idea of a confederacy, right? That was probably came from the Haudenosaunee and this idea they had confederacies. And so I thought that David Burns kind of talked about the influence of Native Americans on our democracy, which I think has been left out except for like Thanksgiving. I think there's more of a, like, I think we, you know, the people that were living in this area were probably influenced by so many things, and especially here, the Dutch, right? And the Dutch were the ones that believed in, you know, freedom of religion. It wasn't the British, right? And capitalism, right? The Tulip Festival, all these kinds of things. But if I ask students from Batavia High School, like, who settled this, who colonized this area, they don't know. It's my students that are from the Netherlands who know, Batavia. Anyway.
Did you get into any of the financing of the war? I know we of course have Robert Morris here, part of the Holland companies.
I think, you know, one of the things that there's, again, I'm going to go to, when he's talking about Payne's really going to be talking about financing and almost the ideas of, you know, criticizing how much it costs. Like the king was taking like $1 million, right? You know what I mean? Like a year, just like an like almost like a welfare family, you know, that kind of thing. And like, it's kind of like, what are we doing? And Payne is really the one who's looking at like, how, you know, why are the British even taxing us so much? It's because they're fighting all these wars. They want us to pay for all this. And we could do it a lot cheaper because George Washington, he was like, you know, would be humble and he wouldn't want, you know, all of this. But of course, Washington has slaves. It makes it complicated how they're making their money, you know. But that's where Payne has whole, if you're interested, whole like chapters, which are like, if you're an accountant, it's going to be going over all of the, you know, here's how this would be paid for and this. To me, it's boring, but they really were trying to get it down to how we could do this in terms of taxation, how they would pay for the war. I think the book talks about, you know, how, you know, it's difficult to raise money, and David McCullough probably does a better job of it, of really talking about, you know, how the troops were really were unprepared for the winters. Like, I'm reading this stuff during our past winter, and they're dragging cannons from Fort Ticonderoga through the Berkshires, and I just drove through that. What the hell, like, you know, and like how the things that they had to go through, and the, you know, the support that they probably had to have from the communities in terms of, you know, and that's where you're gonna, McCullough's gonna bring in the women and the food and the farmers and all these kind of things that had to have happened. And one of the things that Payne talked about is that the women often had to bear the loss of their husbands, you know, in terms of like these battles and providing care. And I think Payne was like, there should be monuments and, you know, statues for the women that helped with this revolution. And that's where, you know, but what was, did you want to say something?
Well, as a sociologist,
yes,
looking at Washington's army,
yes,
the vast bulk of it was poor.
yeah,
Poor Irish,
yeah,
poor English, 15 to 20% black. I remember reading Philip Schuyler at Ticonderoga when he inspected the fort. He says, "Have we no white men to fight this war?"
yeah.
given the fact that the colonies, there was maybe what, a third that were neutral, a third that were zealous for independence,
Yeah.
maybe a third that were loyalists. And yet you have this army that is composed of the least advantaged. Does the author speak about that at all? And as a sociologist, can you speak on that?
Well, when the winter is gonna come in at the end of 1776, and there's a point where the year's coming up, and it's kind of like, are you gonna stay with us? You know, are you gonna stay? You're gonna go back home? And they're really in bad shape.
Very good.
And the author, you know, it was Washington is gonna give the speeches that are gonna turn people to stay in, you know, and that's probably his, you know, strength in terms of his stature and his character, to say, I'm gonna be here with the fight, you know. Of course, you know, it's more McCullough's talking about he's staying in really nice conditions, you know, he would be coming out, you know, but I think he termed it on that. But I think, when I think about it, I think about why my grandparents came here, you know. My grandparents on my dad's side are Irish, and a lot of the people who came here, what the book talks about, were not the landed gentry. They weren't people that, because, you know, those people would have benefited for this inheritance and this whole feudal system. They were people like Payne, a tax collector, lose a job, I got nothing to lose, I'm gonna come over here, you know. And I look at that as my grandfather, he was one of 10 kids. When is he gonna, and he's the youngest, when is he gonna get the farm? And so you could, you know, if you look at it, sometimes we criticize and say, okay, it was only you know, the people with property can vote or whatever, but property was gonna be like, you're gonna have a farm. 90%, in 1790 in the census, they're gonna be farmers. And, you know, not gonna be making much money, but just surviving. But the idea that you could have land, of course, that's gonna be the tensions. And that's where, again, when you look at, Batavia is known as the birthplace of Western New York. Why is that? It said, well, the Holland Land Company, right? And they're the ones that are gonna divide the land. And my lease in Western New York, you know, is gonna have that as, you know, one of the first landowners in terms of making money off of real estate, which, right, that's gonna be a big part of capitalism that I think is sometimes neglected. But, so sometimes I think, you know, like I'm playing cards with my friends and they're like, oh, it's always, you know, these rich people and elite that were, you know, with these, but like you say, it wasn't always that. So I think that goes probably to the long tradition of the American dream, don't you think? Mm-hmm. And people are, but I think the book says, and we can see if you agree with this, that it really was about political rights, not necessarily economic. That's what the book is arguing. That they're arguing for the, you know, the rights. They believed in the rights of, you know, that we can govern ourselves. They wanted to vote, things like this. And then the other things would come along, I think. I think that's kind of a little more. So I don't know if that's, you know, the right answer, but kind of what I got.
I think I mean, part of the fuel to the fire was economic, you know, with the Stamp Act in particular.
Yeah.
That outraged, you know, not just the business people in New England,
Yeah.
but everyone.
You have to understand, as a sociologist who's trained to be a Marxist. And so Marx would, right, he was part of the training, he's a sociologist. And a Marxist is always going to say, and look at it through the economic, right? It's the people, the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, the burgeoning capitalists, they're going to drive everything. But I don't believe that. I believe in the power of ideas. So I'm more what's called Weberian. Why am I a teacher? Why am I here? I believe in ideas. I believe in the things that we're talking about. That's why I go to the library every day. And I come to every single day. And, you know, people the administrators are like, you're wasting your time. What are you doing? Reading books, talking to the librarians. I'm always talking to librarians. From the time, 1980 fucking two, sorry. Sorry.
It happens.
But those are the librarians are going to be the dangerous individuals who are going to say we should be able to read these books, whatever it is. They're the libertarians, and they're going to be the ones, and when the Patriot Act comes out, And section 215 says the government can start looking at what books, and you can start, get in trouble if I'm under investigation and you say, hey, they want a list of what books I'm reading. It's the librarians that are going to write petitions against that and argue that that needs to be changed. That creates a chilling effect on free speech. Don't you think? So I always think, I had a librarian who lived across the street. Don't mess with librarians. They are really connected to the community. Just on an anecdotal, in Buffalo, the librarian, she wanted to have her front garden be wild, and she would play folk music, and maybe some people smoked some marijuana. And then you had, the deputy mayor comes in, and the mayor's coming around, and now he's at Batavia Downs, but he was like, what is with this? This is not like Amherst, all these terrible gardens. So they wanted to, come out with inspectors. And so then what happened? The librarians, they get someone to write a blog. Buffalo criminalized gardens. And they weren't criminalizing, but I told Byron Brown, don't mess with the librarian. You don't do it. And then when it got out to the San Francisco Chronicle, and a story that Buffalo was criminalizing gardens, and then it went to the New York Times, and then it goes to Chuck Schumer, and Chuck Schumer calls Byron Brown, and then Byron Brown shows up with his limo across the street with the librarian. I go across the street and I say, I told you not to. Don't do it. You did it. He's like, they're going to these blogs, and I'm like, I told you, don't cross it. Don't do it. You should listen to me. And the librarians. Sorry, that's my shout out too. Oh God. Oh God, help me. No, you want them on your side, yes.
Who would you say is a modern day Thomas Paine? Do we have an equivalent in today's world?
That's a great question. I don't know. Me.
Somebody in our political sphere.
I am in your political sphere. Here. No, I mean, yeah, I got you. I don't know, maybe Bernie Sanders, I don't know.
He's who came to mind.
Yeah, I think so. I think with Bernie, I think like where he's for democratic socialism in a revolution that would include not just like the negative rights, what the government can't do to us, but to expand it to universal health care, things like that. And I think early in my career, I just kind of, one of my stories is that my sister was born with a developmental disability, and I initially worked on studies that looked at, in the 1980s, what if we funded kids that are born with pre-existing conditions? And so with autism, spina bifida, and other developmental disabilities. So as sociologists, we did the study, and we looked at it and we said, hey, here's the cost, and then Congress just threw it out. So sometimes as a sociologist, we know that our studies, that the politicians don't care what we're doing. So sometimes as a person, I will go to Byron Brown. I will go to Albany. And sometimes I lobby, but that gets me in trouble with academics. And that's part of the challenge that we have in having academic freedom, I think. And what is our lane, and how far can we go on these topics? As a sociologist, I probably have more free reign. I happen to teach all the DEI social justice classes on campus, and we have college classes at Attica, Groveland, Wyoming, and we're expanding to hopefully Albion and Orleans. So, I got to go there. That's one of the hardest debates I got to have, is when I'm there and everyone's got state issue green, and some people are going to be MAGA, neo-Nazis, and I'm going to say, I'm going to win all arguments today. And if I hear you saying that you won an argument, there's going to be feats of strength, okay? That's where we're going to go to. I'm not saying it's right, but that's how I am.